The day David Merritt rode into Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878, he made two promises to himself. One was that he would never settle in a town that smelled this strongly of cattle, and the other was that he would never, not in this life or any that came after, kneel before a woman. He had kept the second promise for 31 years. The first one lasted about 4 days. Caldwell sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border like a man leaning too far over a fence, unsure whether to fall forward or pull himself back. It was a cattle town in every sense of the word, dusty, loud, perpetually on the edge of something violent, and full of men who wore their pride the way others wore their hats, tilted forward against the wind so nobody could quite see their eyes. The Kisham Trail ran cattle right through its heart, and every spring the drives came north, and every spring the town swelled with drovers and gamblers and women who worked the dance halls and merchants who charged too much for too little. There were good people here too, quiet people. People who had come west looking for something they couldn't quite name and had found instead a town that asked everything of them and gave back only the chance to try again tomorrow. David Merritt was not supposed to be one of those people. He had ridden down from Dodge City with a letter of introduction from a man named Carver who ran cattle north of the Arkansas River, and the letter was supposed to get him work at the Ellsworth Ranch, a homestead about 2 miles east of Caldwell proper, sitting on a flat stretch of good grass near a creek that didn't dry out even in August, which was as close to a miracle as the Kansas prairie offered. The ranch was small by the standards of the big Texas outfits, but it ran a clean operation, 60 head of cattle, a few horses, 2 hired hands, and a reputation for fair dealing. What the letter had not told him was that the ranch was run by a woman. He found that out when he rode through Caldwell to ask directions from a man sweeping the steps of the general store, who told him helpfully that the Ellsworth place was east of town past the cottonwoods, and that Miss Gertrude Ellsworth ran it herself now since her father had passed 2 winters ago, and that she was about the most capable and the most stubborn woman in Sumner County, and that if David had any sense at all he would take the job because she paid fair wages and kept a clean bunkhouse. But that he ought to know going in that she had sent 3 men packing for drinking on the property, and another one for lying to her about his experience with horses. David had sat on his horse for a long moment after hearing all of this. Then he had ridden east past the cottonwoods. He told himself it was only because he needed the work. He had been riding for 6 weeks since leaving Dodge City, doing odd jobs and sleeping under the open sky more nights than not, and his back hurt and his horse was tired, and he had less than $2 in his coat pocket. He was not the sort of man who had a great deal of pride about where his wages came from, only about the manner in which he earned them, and there was nothing shameful about working for a woman who ran a ranch honestly. He told himself that, and it was true. But there was another thing he told himself too, riding east past those cottonwoods with the April wind warm against his face, and that was that he would not let any woman have authority over him in any personal sense. He could take direction about cattle and fences and hay bales. That was employment. That was different from the kind of kneeling a man did when he allowed a woman to reach into his chest and rearrange the furniture of his heart. He had watched his father do that, watched the man who had once been the hardest, straightest timber in Montana Territory slowly bend himself around his mother's moods and opinions and needs until you could no longer tell what shape he had originally been. And David had decided very young that he would never let that happen to him. He had kept that promise for 31 years. He was not expecting Gertrude Ellsworth. He came around a stand of cottonwood trees, and the ranch opened before him, the low timber house with a porch running its full length, the red barn beyond it, the fenced paddock where 2 horses stood drowsing in the afternoon light, the kitchen garden along the south wall just beginning to show green shoots pushing through dark soil, and a well in the yard with a pulley and a rope and a woman standing beside it who had just hauled up a bucket of water and who turned at the sound of his horse. She was 26 years old, though he did not know that yet. She was not beautiful in the way that the women in the dance halls were beautiful. She wore no powder, no careful arrangement of curls, no deliberate appeal to the eye. She was wearing a faded blue dress with the sleeves rolled past the elbows, her dark hair pinned back simply at the neck with a few strands escaping across her forehead, and she was holding a wooden pail heavy with water in one hand, while she shaded her eyes with the other to look at him. She had steady gray eyes, and the first thing those eyes did was look at his horse. Not at him, at his horse. "Your animal's carrying a loose shoe on the left hind," she said, before he had even gotten all the way off the saddle. "You ride another hour without addressing that, you'll lame her." He stepped down and checked, and she was right. He straightened up and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water over stones. "You must be the man Carver sent," she said. "Come around to the barn. I'll show you where the tools are." That was how it began. David Merritt fixed his horse's shoe that evening in the barn, while Gertrude Ellsworth stood nearby going over figures in a ledger she had brought with her, which she did not look up from except to occasionally observe that he was doing something correctly, which was more infuriating than if she had criticized him because it implied she had expected him to do it wrong. "You have experience with cattle drives?" she asked, not looking up. "Yes." "How many seasons?" "4 north from Texas." "2 more out of Colorado." She made a mark in the ledger. "Can you read a brand?" "Well enough." "Mend fence?" "I can. I have 2 hands already. Tom Bledsoe has been here 3 years and he knows this land. Hector Ruiz has been here since my father bought him on in '74. They are both good men and I trust them. You'll be the 3rd hand, which means you take direction from me and you do not undermine the arrangement that already exists here. Are we clear on that?" "Clear," David said. She looked up then just briefly to check that he meant it. He did. Work was work. "Wages are $15 a month, meals included, bunkhouse on the north end of the barn, no drinking on the property. You work Sunday mornings until noon, rest in the afternoon. If you have business in town that requires you to be gone overnight, you tell me in advance and you come back in condition to work." "Any questions?" "No, ma'am." She went back to her ledger. David went back to the shoe. Outside, the sun went down over the Kansas prairie in long horizontal bands of orange and red, and somewhere across the flat land a coyote called once and went quiet, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and Gertrude Ellsworth turned a page in her ledger and drew a clean line under a column of figures with the calm, precise authority of someone who had been doing this a long time. David Merritt did not kneel before women, but he found himself staying later in the barn than he needed to, on the pretense of checking that the horse's foot was settled right, and he could hear the quiet scratch of her pen against the paper, and he did not particularly want to go to the bunkhouse yet. He went anyway. Tom Bledsoe was a lean, weathered man of about 45 who welcomed David with a handshake and a brief rundown of the ranch's routines, with the efficiency of a man who had given this speech before. Hector Ruiz was perhaps 30, Mexican-born, quiet in the way of someone who had learned that being quiet in a new country was often safer than not being quiet, and he offered David a cup of coffee and a nod that said more than most men's speeches. "You worked for a woman before?" Tom asked. "No," David said. "She's not what you expect," Tom said. "Took me about 2 weeks to understand that. After that it was fine." David drank his coffee and said he was sure it would be fine and went to bed, and lay on his back in the dark listening to the prairie sounds, the wind, the insects, something moving in the grass a long way off, and thought about steady gray eyes that had looked first at his horse, and decided this was going to be perfectly manageable. The first week passed in the straightforward rhythm of ranch work. David mended 3 sections of fence along the eastern pasture, helped move the cattle to fresh grass, and spent 2 afternoons repairing the gate on the paddock which had warped over the winter and would no longer latch properly. Gertrude checked his work without comment, which he was learning meant the work was satisfactory. On Friday of that first week, a man rode up from Caldwell claiming that 2 of the Ellsworth cattle had drifted south and were grazing on his lease. Gertrude came out to the porch to hear him out, standing with her arms crossed and her face neutral. And the man, broad-shouldered, older, the type who was used to getting what he wanted through sheer presence, talked too loudly and leaned forward in his saddle, and said something about how it was a shame for a young woman to be trying to manage all this by herself, and that perhaps she ought to think about selling up, that he himself might be in a position to make her a fair offer. David was mending a hinge on the barn door and heard all of this. He watched Gertrude Ellsworth. She did not change her expression. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I'll ride out tomorrow and retrieve my cattle if they've crossed the line, and I'll buy you a drink at Reardon's next time I'm in town to settle any inconvenience. As for selling, I'll let you know if I ever decide to do that. I imagine it'll be sometime after I'm dead. Good afternoon." She turned and went back inside before the man could formulate a response. David went back to the hinge, and he was smiling, and he did not examine why. The cattle were retrieved the next morning. Gertrude rode out herself with Hector, and they were back by 11 with both animals and without incident. David watched her come in through the gate on a bay mare she rode well, sitting straight in the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more of her life on horseback than off it, and he thought of the man's condescending assumption that she needed help, and felt something sharpen in his chest that might have been admiration if he had been paying closer attention to himself. He was not paying close attention. He was mending a hinge. The second week brought rain, 3 days of it, gray and steady, the kind that turned the yard to mud and made the cattle stand in miserable groups against the fence line, and made every chore twice as hard. David moved bales, reinforced a section of the barn roof where water was coming through, and spent one long afternoon helping Gertrude haul supplies from the storage shed to the house, because the mud had made the kitchen garden path nearly impassable, and she needed preserves and flour brought across before the path got any worse. He had not spent that much time in close company with her before. The work brought them near each other in the narrow shed doorway, handing crates and jars back and forth, the rain loud on the shed roof, and they talked not about anything of consequence, about the rain, about whether the south pasture had adequate drainage, about a horse she had purchased the previous autumn that had taken until February to settle properly into the herd. "Why'd you come to Caldwell?" she asked, between trips, setting a crate on the porch table. "Carver's letter said you were in Dodge City." "Work was thinner there than I wanted," he said. "Figured south was as good a direction as any. You have family somewhere, not to speak of." She looked at him. Not in the probing way of someone trying to unlock a secret, but in the considering way of someone who has been asked a question themselves and is deciding how to answer it. "My father came to Kansas from Ohio in '68, she said. He was 32 years old, and he had $200 and a belief that the land would be honest with him if he was honest with it. He was right about that mostly. He left Ohio because he had a brother there who had borrowed money from him and refused to pay it back, and their mother had taken the brother's side, and my father decided that a clean break was worth more than a resolved argument. Was he happy here? I think so. He was a man who needed work and space and people who kept their word. He found all of those here eventually." She picked up another crate. David picked up the heavier one. "What about your mother?" he asked. Something shifted in her face, not grief exactly, but the kind of settled acknowledgement of grief that comes when a person has made peace with a loss and carries it now as part of themselves rather than as a wound. "She died when I was 14. Fever. My father and I managed. You were just the two of you, for 12 years. Then he had a bad winter, 1876, and his heart gave out before spring." She said it plainly, not inviting sympathy but not refusing it either. "I had been running most of the operations for 2 years by then. He taught me everything. And you stayed." "Of course I stayed. This is my land." She said it the way you say something that is so fundamentally obvious that the question almost doesn't make sense. And David thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, thought about the clarity of it, the simplicity of a person who knew exactly what they were and what they were doing and why. and felt something in his own chest that was the feeling you get when you are lost on a trail and you hear water somewhere nearby, the feeling of orientation, of something directing you toward where you ought to go. He ignored it comprehensively. 3 weeks into April, a man named Gerald Foote arrived in Caldwell with a contract from one of the big outfits, the Southwestern Cattle Combine, which was exactly the kind of organization its name suggested, a consolidating operation that had been buying up smaller ranches across southern Kansas for 2 years. Foote was polite and well-dressed in the manner of someone who had been sent specifically, because polite and well-dressed got better results than rough and demanding, and he requested a meeting with Gertrude Ellsworth to discuss, as he put it, an arrangement that would benefit all parties considerably. He arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday with a briefcase of papers and a manner that suggested he was conferring a great favor by being there. David was in the paddock working with the young horse when Foote's hired carriage came up the drive, and he watched from the fence as Gertrude came out to the porch and shook Foote's hand with the precise degree of courtesy that said she was not impressed but she was willing to hear a proposal. They went inside. David went back to the horse. An hour later, Foote came out again. He did not look like a man who had been told what he wanted to hear. He tipped his hat to Gertrude, who stood in the doorway, and drove away in his carriage, and the dust settled behind him, and Gertrude went back inside and did not slam the door, which David thought showed considerable restraint. He found out from Tom that evening that Foote had offered to buy the ranch outright for a figure that was probably fair by market standards, and that Gertrude had informed him she was not selling. Foote had suggested that she might want to think carefully about a woman trying to run a full cattle operation alone. Gertrude had told him that she had 3 hired hands and a functioning brain and had been running this ranch for 2 years without difficulty, and that she thanked him for his interest and had shown him to the door. "He'll be back," Tom said, pouring coffee. "These combined people don't give up easy." "Will she sell?" David asked. Tom looked at him as if the question were slightly absurd. "No," he said. David nodded and finished his coffee. He thought about her saying, "This is my land," with that complete, unquestioning certainty, and he felt proud of her in a way that he had no particular right to feel, and he pushed that feeling down to somewhere below the conversation level of his thoughts and went asleep. May came in warm and green. The cattle were doing well, the grass thick along the creek, and Gertrude had arranged a small sale of 6 head to a buyer in Wellington that would bring in enough to replace the barn roof before summer. David drove the cattle to Wellington with Tom and Hector, a 2-day trip there and back, and on the second morning of the return journey camped beside a creek with the cattle quiet in the dark. Tom asked him how he was finding the work. "Good," David said. "And the situation?" "What situation?" Tom gave him the look of a man who has lived 45 years and has very little patience for pretense. "The situation of working for a woman you can't stop looking at," he said, and put his coffee down and rolled himself into his blanket and went to sleep. David sat by the fire for a long time after that. He was not looking at her. He noticed things. That was different. He noticed when her gray eyes sharpened on a problem, when she made a decision quickly and cleanly without second-guessing herself, when she laughed, which she did not do frequently, but when she did it was sudden and real and took over her whole face. He noticed the way she moved through the ranch with the physical competence of someone who has done real work for a real portion of their life. No wasted movement, everything purposeful. He noticed that she was fair to the men who worked for her and expected fairness in return, and that she did not ask anything of anyone that she was not willing to do herself. He had helped her pull a calf 3 days before they left for Wellington, a difficult birth in the early morning, both of them in the mud of the paddock, and she had worked with him without any drama or confusion. Their hands sometimes closed together in the dark, and when the calf finally came and stood on wobbling legs, she had sat back in the mud and laughed, that sudden, real laugh, and said, "There he is," with such uncomplicated joy that David had felt something move in his chest like a key turning in a long-locked door. He did not kneel before women. He went asleep beside the fire, listening to the cattle settle, and dreamed of gray eyes looking first at his horse and then slowly at him. When they returned from Wellington, Gertrude met them at the gate, looked at the cattle count, looked at the receipt from the buyer and said, "Good. The roof gets done next week then," and walked back to the house. And David stood by his horse watching her go and thought, "I am in considerable difficulty." He did not do anything about it. There was no appropriate thing to do. She was his employer. She was intelligent and capable and entirely self-possessed. She had not given him any indication whatsoever that she thought of him as anything other than a competent hired hand, which was exactly what he was, and that was the right arrangement, and he was going to respect it. He spent the next 2 weeks being extremely professional. He fixed things. He moved cattle. He repaired the barn roof alongside a carpenter from town, named Briggs, who had brought his own apprentice, and who talked the whole time about weather patterns and the price of lumber. And David nailed boards and listened to Briggs, and did not think about Gertrude Ellsworth any more than was absolutely necessary. She came up to the roof on the second day to inspect the progress, and she stood at the edge of the ladder and talked with Briggs about the slope of the new section. And David was behind her on the roof putting nails in, and he could see her profile against the blue May sky. And she tucked a loose strand of hair back behind her ear while she was talking, and he missed hitting the nail head entirely. Briggs looked at him. "Slipped," David said. Briggs looked at him with the same expression Tom had used by the campfire. Apparently David Merritt was not as subtle as he had believed. It was a Tuesday at the end of May when it happened. He had been up since before dawn checking a fence line along the north pasture that Tom had reported looking weak, and by mid-morning he was riding back toward the ranch yard through the warm early summer air, the sky enormous and pale blue above the flatland, everything smelling of grass and earth and the faint water smell of the creek. He came through the gate into the yard and saw Gertrude at the well. She had the rope handle in both hands and she was drawing up a full pail, and she turned slightly at the sound of his horse, and her foot caught on an uneven stone at the base of the well, and her balance shifted, and the pail heavy, dripping, swinging on the rope lurched sideways, and she made a short sound of surprise and let go of the rope to catch herself. And the pail swung free and struck the side of the well with a hollow wooden knock, and water sluiced over the lip of it and soaked her dress and the ground around her feet. David Merritt was off his horse and moving before the thought to move had fully formed in his mind. She had not fallen. She had caught herself on the well's stone rim and was standing straight, slightly breathless, wet, the empty pail rope swinging beside her. She was not hurt. She did not need help, not in any practical sense, because she had already righted herself. But he was already there. He was already beside her with one hand at her elbow and one catching the rope to steady the pail, and he had come off the horse at a run and covered the distance of the yard without stopping, and his momentum had carried him to his knees in the mud beside the well, and he was kneeling. He was on his knees in the dirt of the ranch yard in front of Gertrude Ellsworth. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. Neither of them spoke. He had sworn to himself, with the comprehensive conviction of 31 years, that he would never kneel before any woman. He had meant it in the large metaphorical sense, the sense that he would never bend himself out of his own shape for the sake of a woman's feelings or demands. But here he was in the literal sense too, on his knees in the mud, having moved before the thought told him to move, having acted out of something that was not duty and was not obligation and was not professionalism. He had moved because she had stumbled, and something in him had refused to allow that, had simply refused it the way the body refuses to let you fall without putting out a hand. He was still holding her elbow. He became aware of this. He let go. He stood up slowly, mud on his knees, and she was looking at him with those steady gray eyes and something in them he had not seen there before, not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful attention, the way she looked at something she was genuinely uncertain how to classify. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. They stood there. "Your fence," she asked finally. "Needs 2 posts replaced on the north corner," he said. "I'll get it done before dark." "Good," she said. She picked up the pail. She went back to drawing water, hand over hand on the rope, and David took his horse to the barn and stood with the animal for a moment in the cool shadow, his heart doing something irregular that it hadn't done since he was very young. He had kneeled. He stood there and looked at that fact the way you look at something that is broken, trying to understand how it broke, whether the break was catastrophic or just the breaking open kind, the kind that happens when something has been shut too long and needed the air. He thought about what his father had been before and after, the way he had bent himself into a different shape, the loss of himself in it. But that was not what had happened in the yard. What had happened in the yard was that he had moved toward her. Not away from himself, but toward something else, something outside himself that mattered to him more in that moment than his own balance, his own dignity, his own carefully maintained promise about what he would and would not do for any woman. He had moved toward her, and he had been on his knees, and she had not taken anything from him. She was still out there hauling water. He was still himself. He took care of his horse and went to get the fence posts. The thing that had shifted between them was not spoken, and it was not dramatic, and it was not resolved. It simply existed now, a new fact in the air of the Ellsworth ranch, like the way the light changes at the beginning of summer and everything has the same objects in it, but they look slightly different. David worked the north fence and came back for supper. The 3 hands ate together in the bunkhouse, and Gertrude ate in the house, which had always been the arrangement. But after supper, she sometimes came to the porch and sat in the chair there in the long evening light with a book or the ledger, or occasionally just sitting. And David had sometimes sat on the bunkhouse steps in the evenings, and they had been aware of each other across the yard in the way that 2 people are aware of each other, when they are not talking about the fact that they are aware of each other. That evening she came to the porch with her book, and David sat on the bunkhouse steps, and Tom and Hector played cards inside, and the prairie evening went from gold to amber to a deep blue that was almost purple. "Mr. Merritt," she said across the yard. "Miss Ellsworth. Thank you for this morning." A pause. "You were fine," he said. "I know." Still another pause. "You moved very fast." He did not say anything to that. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went inside. He sat on the steps until it was fully dark and the stars were out across the enormous Kansas sky. And he thought that 31 years was a long time to carry a promise that had started to feel less like protection and more like a room with no windows. June came to the Kansas prairie the way June always did, gradually, and then all at once. The heat arriving like a decision that had been made somewhere else and was now being delivered. The sky going from pale blue to fierce white by midday, and the air smelling of sun-warmed grass and dust and cattle. The ranch was busy in the good, purposeful way of summer, and David found his days shaped by a routine that had started to feel comfortable in a way that no routine had felt in years. He talked with Gertrude more now. Not long conversations, not declarations of anything, but the consistent, building conversation of 2 people who share a place and the business of that place, and have gradually discovered that they are interested in what the other one thinks. She thought about things carefully and stated her conclusions plainly, which he respected. She did not waste words, and she did not use emotion as a lever, which he had been braced for and which did not appear. When she disagreed with him, she did it directly and with reasons, which he found he actually enjoyed. The way he would have enjoyed a good argument with a sensible man, except that it was better because she was not a sensible man. She was Gertrude, and she had a way of finding the exact center of a thing and pointing at it that made you see it whether you wanted to or not. In mid-June, the Southwestern Cattle Combine sent Foot again. This time Foot came with a revised offer higher than the first, and with a second man named Harrison, who was less polite and clearly intended to be pressure. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon when Tom was in town and Hector was mending the south fence and David was in the barn repairing tack. He heard the voices from the yard and he listened. Foote went through his offer again, and Harrison began to suggest that it might become difficult for a woman operating alone to secure certain services, the implication being that the combine had reach in the county that could make things inconvenient. He did not say this bluntly enough to be directly accusable of threatening, but the shape of what he was saying was unmistakable. David put down the bridle he was working on. He went to the barn door and stood there. Gertrude was on the porch, her arms crossed, her face doing the neutral thing, and Harrison was in the middle of saying something about how the county commissioner took a dim view of certain title irregularities. "The title to this land is entirely clear," Gertrude said. "My father filed in '68 and I have full documentation. If there is a commissioner who has told you otherwise, I would like to know his name so that I can address the matter with him directly." Harrison blinked. "And furthermore," she said, "I know what you are doing and I am not impressed by it, and I would like you both to leave my property now, please." David walked out of the barn and stood in the yard between the house and the men. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which was enough. He was a large man and he stood the way men stand when they are not uncertain, and Harrison looked at him and made a calculation and apparently decided the calculation did not favor him. They left. Gertrude watched them go. She stood on the porch until the carriage had cleared the gate, and then she sat down in the porch chair, and for a moment she looked tired, not defeated, but tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has been maintaining a composure they should not have had to maintain. David came to the foot of the porch steps. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "They will come back again, or someone like them will," she said. "The combine wants this parcel because of the creek. Good water access on land this flat is worth more than the cattle." "I know," he said. "I am not selling." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "I may need your help," she said, "figuring out what the proper legal approach is. There's a lawyer in Wellington I've used before. I should write to him about what Harrison said regarding the title." "That's a good idea," he said. She nodded and stood up from the chair and went inside, and David stood at the foot of the porch steps for another moment before going back to the barn, and he thought that she had said, "I may need your help." In the same tone she said everything, matter of fact and without any pretense, but she had said it, and he thought it was the first time he had heard her say she might need anything from another person, and that it had cost her something small but real. He wrote the letter to the Wellington lawyer that evening. He was better with legal language than Gertrude had expected. He had spent 2 seasons in Colorado where he had gotten involved, reluctantly, in a land dispute between a small rancher and a railroad company, and he had learned more than he intended to about boundary filings and documentation requirements. Gertrude sat across the table in the kitchen while he wrote, going over her own papers to confirm the details he needed, and they were side by side at the table for most of an hour, and the lamp between them threw gold light on her face and on the papers and on his hands. "You write well," she said, reading over what he had drafted. "I read a lot," he said. "Long winters." "Montana, you said. Mostly, some Wyoming. Was it beautiful?" He considered the question the way he tried to consider all her questions honestly. "In a hard way," he said. "The kind of beautiful that reminds you it doesn't particularly care whether you're there or not." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. "I think this land is that kind of beautiful too," she said. "People come here thinking the prairie is empty because it's flat. It's not empty. It's just big enough that you have to stay still long enough to see what's in it." He looked at her. She was looking at the letter, and then she looked up and found him looking at her, and something passed between them in that moment that was not quite a conversation but was more than a look. "This is good," she said, tapping the letter. "I'll add my signature and have it posted Monday." "Good," he said. She folded the letter. The lamp flickered. "David," she said. It was the first time she had called him by his first name. He waited. "I want you to know," she said carefully, in the way she said things she had considered, "that I am grateful you're here. Not only because you're a good hand, although you are, but because—" She stopped and looked at the letter and then at the lamp. Because it's been a long time since I felt that someone else was invested in this. She gestured, meaning the ranch, the papers, all of it. My father was the last person who she stopped again. I understand, he said. She nodded once, short and definitive, and stood and said good night, and he watched her go to the door of the kitchen, and then she turned back. You can call me Gertrude, she said, if you'd like. All right, he said. Gertrude. She went out, and he sat at the table with the extinguishing lamp for a long time after. He was in love with her. He sat with that fact the same way he had sat with the fact of being on his knees in the mud looking at it, understanding how it had happened, deciding what it meant. He was in love with Gertrude Ellsworth, with her steady gray eyes and her matter-of-fact competence and her, "This is my land," and the way she had said, "I may need your help," as though it had taken genuine effort, and the way she laughed when the calf stood up, and the way she read her ledger by lamplight, and the way she had sent Gerald Foote packing twice and would send him packing again if it came to that. He was in love with her. He had sworn he would never kneel before any woman. He had already been on his knees in the mud. The question was what he was going to do about it. What he did for the next 2 weeks was nothing, which was both the cowardly choice and the careful one, and he knew the difference, but he was not ready to stop making it. He was her employee. He was a man who had ridden into her life on the back of a letter from a man she trusted. He had nothing to offer her that she did not already have. She owned land, she ran a business, she was capable and intelligent, and she did not need anyone to rescue her, which was one of the things he loved about her. He did not know what he could give her that she wanted. But June turned toward July, and the days were long and hot and gold, and they talked every evening, sometimes from across the yard and sometimes sitting on the porch steps together, which had become a gradual development that neither of them had specifically arranged. And David found that the walls he had built in himself over 31 years were not falling down, but were becoming transparent, becoming more like windows than walls, so that he could see through them clearly. And what he saw on the other side was Gertrude Ellsworth sitting on her own porch steps in the July evening, talking about whether the south pasture needed to be rested next season. He was not bending himself out of his own shape. He was still himself. He still had opinions, and he stated them, and sometimes she disagreed, and sometimes he was wrong, and sometimes she was, and they both survived it. He was still the same man who had ridden down from Dodge City with $2 and a letter. He was just that man sitting on porch steps in the long summer evening, increasingly aware that this was exactly where he wanted to be. It was Tom who finally said something direct. On a hot July afternoon, while they were both working on the water trough behind the barn, David replacing a plank that had rotted through and Tom caulking the joints. "You're going to have to say something to her eventually," Tom said without preamble. David kept his eyes on the plank. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Tom said patiently. "I've been watching men fall in love for 45 years, David. I know what it looks like, and I know what the particular version of it looks like when the man in question has decided he doesn't fall in love and is therefore being somewhat stupid about the whole thing." David didn't say anything. "She's not easy, is what I'll tell you," Tom said. "She's not going to make it simple for you. She's guarded, too, in her own way for reasons of her own, but she respects you. That's the beginning of most things worth having." David set the plank and held it. "She's my employer." "She is," Tom agreed. "That's a complication, not an impossibility." They worked in silence for a while. "What if she doesn't feel the same?" David said. It was the most honest question he had asked out loud about any of this. Tom caulked a joint and considered. "Then you'll know," he said, "and that's better than not knowing." That evening the Wellington lawyer's reply arrived. Gertrude read it at the table and then read it again, and then said "good," in the particular way that meant it was very good, and showed it to David. The lawyer confirmed that the title was clean and the documentation was complete, and that the Commissioner Harrison had referenced had no legitimate authority to revisit any claim, and that the Combine's approach had some of the characteristics of harassment, and that if they attempted it again, there were legal remedies available. Gertrude folded the letter and looked at David and said, "Good," again, and then she smiled, not the sudden full laugh, but a smaller and more private version of it, just the corners of her mouth lifting, and said, "We are not going anywhere." He looked at her smiling in the lamplight and thought, "I am not going anywhere either." He said, "Gertrude." She heard something in the way he said it, and the smile settled into that careful attention again, the uncertain classification. "I want to be honest with you," he said, "because you're honest with me, and I think that's the right way to do things." She waited. "I have been here since April," he said, "and in that time I have become, I am." He stopped, which was not like him. He was not a man who lost words. He found them. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I'm not saying that to make anything complicated or to put you in a position that makes the arrangement here difficult. And if you'd rather I hadn't said it, I understand that. And I'll go back to working for you just as I have been, and I'll keep my own counsel on the matter. But Tom tells me I need to say it, and Tom is generally right about things." Gertrude looked at him. She looked at him for a long time without speaking, and he sat with that, with the weight of having said the truth out loud and not knowing what it would do. "You came here with a letter from Carver," she said finally. "Yes. You fixed your horse's shoe, and you fixed the gate and the fence and the barn roof, and you drove my cattle to Wellington, and you wrote that letter to the lawyer." "Yes," he said. "You moved across the yard in about 3 seconds the morning I tripped at the well," she said. "I noticed that." He said nothing. "I noticed all of it," she said. She looked at the letter in her hands and then at him. I have not expected this," she said. "I built this life to be managed alone because that was what I had. I am not sure how to." She stopped. "I'm not sure I know how to let someone in," she said, with the careful precision of someone stating a truth they have examined and found to be accurate. "I don't either," he said. "I'm not particularly experienced at it." "That seems unlikely," she said, and there was a dry note in it that made him half smile. "I mean this specific kind," he said, "the lasting kind." She was quiet. "Gertrude," he said, "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to know where I stand. That's all." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she nodded. The short, definitive nod that meant something had been received and was being properly considered, and she said, "All right." "Good night, David." "Good night," he said. He went to the bunkhouse. Tom looked up from his book. "Well," Tom said. "She's thinking about it," David said. Tom nodded approvingly and went back to his book. July moved through its long, hot days, and something was different in the air between them, not tense exactly, but charged, the way the air gets before a summer storm when you can feel the electricity building in it long before the thunder comes. They went about the work of the ranch, and they talked in the evenings, and she looked at him differently. The way she looked at something she was calculating, except that there was warmth in it that had not been there before, or that had been there but was now allowed to show. On a Saturday in mid-July, Hector's younger brother arrived from Wichita on his way to visiting family in the territory, and Hector asked for the Saturday evening off, and Gertrude gave it. Tom rode into Caldwell for his customary Saturday visit to the barber shop and the general store, and David and Gertrude were alone on the ranch for the first time since he had been there. It was not dramatic or dangerous or anything, but what it was, two people who had been careful with each other for weeks, suddenly without the gentle buffer of other people around. They did the evening chores together, the way they sometimes did when the men were occupied, and the barn was golden with late light, and the cattle were settled and the horses were fed, and Gertrude was brushing down the bay mare, and David was across the aisle doing the same for his own horse, and she said, "I have been thinking about what you said." He kept brushing. "I suspected you might be. I don't make decisions quickly," she said. "I've noticed that. It's a quality I respect." She was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted under the brush. "When my father died," she said, "I decided that I would run this ranch the way he had run it, and I would not let difficulty make me compromise on anything essential, and I have done that. For 2 years I have done exactly that." "You have," he said, "but I made a kind of agreement with myself," she said carefully, "that I would not need anything I did not already have, that wanting anything more than what was here would be a kind of weakness." She paused. "I think that agreement was wrong," she said. "I think I made it out of grief, and I have been keeping it past the point where it was necessary." David stopped brushing and looked across the aisle at her. She was looking at him. "I think," she said, "that I have also been in love with you for some time. I think possibly since the morning you were on your knees in the mud and you looked up at me with absolutely no idea what to do about it." He laughed. It was surprised out of him, the honest kind of laugh, and she smiled, the full version, the sudden taking over her whole face version, and for a moment the barn was full of the sound of both of them. He crossed the aisle. He was careful because she deserved care, and she stood by the mare with the brush in her hand and looked at him with those steady gray eyes that were steady even now, even in this, and he said, "May I?" And she said, "Yes," and he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same directness she applied to everything, and the mare shifted again, and the evening light turned to gold, and then to amber in the open barn door. And outside the Kansas prairie stretched away in every direction for miles under the enormous sky. They went back to the house and sat on the porch until dark, talking the way they had always talked, but now without the careful management of what was and wasn't being said, talking about things that mattered, about his years in Montana and Wyoming, and what he had been looking for in all that movement, about her father and the ranch and what she wanted for it, about what they each needed and what they were afraid of, honestly and without performance. In the way of two people who have spent some time being honest with each other about smaller things and have found the muscle is there for the larger ones. She told him she had been lonely. She said it directly, without decoration, the way she said hard things. She said she had not admitted it to herself for 2 years because admitting it felt like failure, like not being sufficient to the life she had built, but that it was true and she thought he should know it. He told her that he had been moving for years because stillness made him feel the absence of something he did not have words for, and that he had mistaken the absence for a preference for motion, but that since April he had not wanted to move anywhere. She reached across and took his hand. They sat on the porch in the dark with the Kansas stars overhead, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence David Merritt had been in for as long as he could remember. August arrived, and Gerald Foote did not come back. The Wellington lawyer sent a brief note indicating that he had been in communication with a colleague at the county level who had confirmed that there were no legitimate title questions regarding the Ellsworth property, and that the combine appeared to have redirected its attention south. Gertrude read the note and folded it and put it in the box where she kept the ranch's important papers and said, "Good," for the 3rd time regarding that particular matter, and that was the end of it. The summer continued, full of work and long evenings and the gradual deepening of something between David and Gertrude that had started as a fact and was becoming a foundation. He still worked for her, and that was not yet awkward because they both understood the ranch's operations too well to let personal feeling make them impractical, and because Gertrude was constitutionally incapable of not being fair-minded about work regardless of what else was happening. Tom gave David a look at breakfast one morning that said he was glad he had dispensed his advice when he did, and David acknowledged this look with a brief nod, and Tom went back to his eggs, satisfied. Hector, who was perceptive and warm-hearted and had been quietly aware of the situation for weeks, simply smiled more often around both of them, which said everything it needed to. On a Sunday evening at the end of August, sitting on the porch with the last light going purple over the flat land, David said, "I want to ask you something." Gertrude looked at him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want this to be clear and not uncertain. I want to stay here, not as your hired hand but as your partner in this place, and I want to build things with you, and I want to be honest with you for the rest of my life because you deserve honesty, and I want to sit on this porch with you when we're old and watch the prairie go dark every night." She was quiet. "I know I'm not," he started. "You don't have to justify yourself to me," she said. "I know who you are." He waited. She looked out at the prairie for a moment, and then she turned back to him with those gray eyes steady and the corners of her mouth doing the small private smile. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, David Merritt." He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since April. She laughed, the sudden full laugh, and leaned against him on the porch steps, and he put his arm around her, and the prairie went dark, and the stars came out over Kansas. They were married in October of 1878 at the First Methodist Church in Caldwell, in a ceremony that was not large because neither of them had a great deal of family to invite. But that was attended by Tom and Hector and Briggs the carpenter, and the lawyer's wife from Wellington who had come up for a visit and stayed for the occasion, and half of Caldwell who came because Gertrude was known and respected in the town, and a wedding was always a reason to gather. The Reverend was a brisk man who kept his ceremonies to the necessary elements, which both David and Gertrude appreciated, and when it was done, they were pronounced husband and wife in front of the gathered assembly of their small world, and David kissed his bride with more feeling than he had intended to demonstrate publicly, and Tom Bledsoe cleared his throat, and Hector looked at the ceiling with a wide smile. Gertrude wore her mother's dress, which she had kept carefully for 12 years, dark blue wool with white at the cuffs and neck, and she wore her hair up with 2 ivory pins that had also been her mother's, and she looked, David thought, like herself entirely and completely herself, which was all he had ever wanted. Afterwards there was a gathering at the ranch, and Hector played guitar under the cottonwoods, and there was food and laughter, and Tom gave a toast that was short and honest and made both of them look at the ground for a moment. Someone brought a fiddle, and the music went on into the autumn evening, and the trees were gold in the late October light, and the prairie was wide and amber and full of the smell of grass and the coming of the first cold. They danced on the grass under the cottonwoods, David and Gertrude, in the easy way of 2 people who are comfortable in the space they make together, and she said close to his ear, "We need to talk about the winter cattle rotation." He pulled back to look at her. She was entirely serious, and then the serious face broke into the sudden laugh. "I love you," he said, which was not something he had said yet in those words, though it had been present in everything for months, and she heard it land, and her face did something that was not the sudden laugh and was not the small private smile, but was something new, something he had not seen before, something that was only for him. "I love you too," she said. "We can discuss the cattle rotation tomorrow." "Deal," he said. They danced until the stars were out. The first winter of their marriage was cold in the proper Kansas way, the kind of cold that comes down from the north with conviction and stays, and the work was harder, but the evenings were different now. The 2 of them in the house together after supper with the fire going, and David had brought a number of books from his saddlebag that had been waiting patiently since Dodge City, and Gertrude had the ledger and the plans for spring. And they spent evenings on opposite sides of the fireplace reading and talking, and sometimes just being in the same room in the warmth of the fire. He learned the small things about her that you only learn by living beside someone, that she woke early and could not fall back asleep, that she was nearly always right about the weather, that she had an unexpected and somewhat sharp sense of humor that came out when she was relaxed, that she was kind to animals in a way she was careful not to perform, just genuinely and practically kind, that she sometimes worried in the night and lay quiet beside him with that worry until he asked her about it and she told him, and telling him seemed to help. She learned things about him too, that he was a better cook than he had admitted, which he confessed had seemed professionally inappropriate before, that he had strong opinions about horses that he had similarly kept to himself, that he was patient about nearly everything except dishonesty, which made him briefly but sharply angry in a way that was clean and went away quickly, that he had nightmares sometimes, not often, about a winter in Wyoming he did not talk about at length, and that he was better when he knew she was there. She was there. Tom rode out that winter with a bad cold that turned into something worse, and they took him into the house, and Gertrude nursed him back to health over 2 weeks with the practical efficiency she brought to all crises, and Tom said afterward that he had been taken better care of than he had a right to expect, and that he owed her considerably. "You owe me nothing," Gertrude said. "You've worked this land for 3 years." "I've worked it for pay," Tom said. "This was above pay." "Then call it friendship and stop making it a transaction," she said, and handed him a bowl of soup and left him to it. Tom looked at David. David shrugged. "She's right," he said. Tom went back to his soup. "Yes," he said. "She usually is." Spring came, and with it the work of a new season, and Gertrude had plans she had been developing all winter, expanding the herd, improving the breeding stock, and a scheme she had been turning over for the kitchen garden that would supply enough vegetables not only for the household, but for selling at the Caldwell market in summer, which would bring in reliable income in the months between cattle sales. David helped build the expanded garden beds along the east wall of the house, digging and framing through 2 weeks of April, and Gertrude planted with the same methodical competence she applied to everything. And the garden took, and by June it was producing abundantly, and she was right about the market. There were people in Caldwell who wanted fresh vegetables and were willing to pay for them, and Gertrude drove a wagon into town on Thursdays with her produce and came back with both income and satisfaction. "You look pleased," David told her one Thursday evening when she came back from market with a nearly empty wagon and coins in the cash box. "I am pleased," she said without any apology for it. "It works." "Of course it works," he said. "You planned it." She looked at him with a private smile and said, "Don't be charming." "I mean it factually," he said. She kissed him and took the cash box inside. He unhitched the wagon horse, smiling at nothing in particular, and the June evening was warm and gold and the garden smelled of green things growing. In the autumn of 1879, their first full year of marriage, Gertrude told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the matter-of-fact way she told everything, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee. But there was something around her eyes that was not matter-of-fact, something that was wondering and slightly afraid and considerably hopeful, and David sat down across from her and took her hands and said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm yes." "Are you?" "Yes," he said before she finished the question. "Gertrude, yes," she exhaled. The wondering look settled into something warmer. "I'll need to adjust the schedule for spring," she said. "The timing will put me in the last months during planting." He looked at her. "We can manage it," she said, and then she laughed, not the full sudden laugh but something softer, more private than that, almost shy, which was not a word he had ever previously associated with Gertrude Ellsworth Merritt. "I'm not worried," she said. "I just wanted you to know." He came around the table and she stood and he held her for a long moment in the kitchen, and outside the October Kansas wind moved through the cottonwoods. "We'll manage everything," he said. The winter of 1879 into 1880 passed in the way of winters when there is something coming, with a quality of anticipation that made even the hard, cold days feel purposeful. David took on more of the outdoor work without comment, and Gertrude ran the household accounts and the market planning and the correspondence with the Wellington lawyer, who had become a regular correspondent about various county matters, and wrote letters to Tom's sister in Missouri, who had expressed interest in sending her oldest son west to work, and generally ran things, which was her nature and which was not going to change because she was expecting a baby. She said as much to the Reverend's wife, who came calling in February and inquired solicitously whether Gertrude was resting enough. And Gertrude said that she was resting precisely as much as was necessary and working precisely as much as was useful, and that she was in excellent health, and offered the Reverend's wife tea. The Reverend's wife reported to several people in town that Gertrude Merritt was exactly the same person she had always been, which appeared to surprise some of them, and not others. The baby came in April of 1880, a boy they named James Edmund Merritt, arriving in the early morning while the spring rain came straight down on the ranch roof, and the cottonwoods budded pale green outside the bedroom window. He was a healthy, loud, opinionated infant who made his preferences known with great energy from the first, and Gertrude held him in the morning light with a look on her face that David had not seen before and would never forget, a look of complete and utter recognition, as though she had known him before and was simply seeing him again. "Hello," she said to the baby, quietly. "There you are." David sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and thought that there were things in this world that made every difficult mile of the road that led to them make sense, and this was one of them. Tom, who had held himself together composedly through the news and through the waiting, came to the door of the house when David announced the arrival and shook David's hand with the grip of a much younger man and said, "Congratulations," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and then went back to the barn to collect himself, which everyone allowed him to do without comment. Hector brought flowers from wherever he had found them on the April prairie, small and determined and yellow, and left them on the porch without making an occasion of it. James Edmund Merritt grew in the way of children raised on working land quickly, with a great deal of energy, and in direct proportion to how much of the ranch's operations he could observe and participate in. By the time he was 2, he was following his father around the barn with an expression of deep seriousness, and by 3, he was being included in small tasks with the horses under careful supervision. Gertrude watched her son the way she watched everything she cared about, not hovering, not anxious, but attentive, the way a person tends a garden, present and responsive, and allowing the growing to happen at its own pace. In 1882, a daughter came, Ruth Margaret Merritt, named for Gertrude's mother Ruth, and for no particular second reason except that it sounded right. She arrived in November, smaller than James had been, quieter from the start, with Gertrude's gray eyes and David's dark hair, and she settled into the life of the ranch with a self-possession that seemed impossible for an infant but was undeniable. The family grew around the ranch, and the ranch grew around the family. Tom Bledsoe's nephew, Samuel, arrived from Missouri the spring of James's 3rd birthday, and proved to be exactly the kind of young man Tom had hoped: honest, willing, good with cattle and better with horses, and considerably gentler than he looked, which was often the way with big men. He stayed, and the ranch ran 4 hands through the busy summers, which allowed Gertrude to expand the herd again and add a second market garden rotation that she had been planning for 2 years. The combine sent no one else after foot. The word in town was that the combine had overextended in the central Kansas parcels and had pulled back its acquisitions operations. The county commissioner whom Harrison had referenced turned out to have been, as suspected, in the combine's pocket to some degree, and a change in county government had resolved that problem in a way that had nothing directly to do with the Ellsworth ranch but served its interests nonetheless. "Justice sometimes works sideways," Gertrude said when David told her about it. "You just have to be patient enough to wait for it. And to not sell in the meantime," he said. "That too," she agreed. Caldwell grew and changed around them in the way of cattle towns on the trail, sometimes prosperous, sometimes rough, the population shifting with the seasons and the drives. There were years when the trail north was busy and the town ran full of drovers and money and noise, and years when the cattle market softened and the drives slowed and the town contracted. Through all of it, the Ellsworth Merritt Ranch maintained its footing, the creek water reliable, the grass good, the operation steady and clean. David became a well-known figure in the county in a quiet way, not loud, not political, but consistently present, and known to be a man of his word, which in a cattle county was enough to build a reputation on. He served 2 terms on the county agricultural board, which he found tedious but important, and which Gertrude told him was an obligation of being part of a community, so he went to the meetings. She was right. She usually was. In 1883, she expanded the market garden again and started supplying not just the Caldwell market but a general store in Wellington through a regular arrangement, and that income made the difference when beef prices dipped the following year, and the cattle operation ran at reduced margin. David looked at the books with her that year and said, "The garden saved us." "The garden was part of the plan," she said. "You planned for a price dip." "I planned for contingency," she said. "Price dips are contingencies." He shook his head, which he did sometimes in genuine admiration. She noticed. She always noticed. "Stop that," she said. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "You're being charming again." "I told you before I mean it factually." She gave him the private smile and went back to the ledger. James Merritt grew into a boy of considerable character and opinions, and at 8 years old he could help with the cattle, and at 9 he could ride well enough to make himself useful on drives to town, and at 10 he announced at supper one evening that he intended to study law, because he had heard his mother talk about the legal matters with the combine, and he thought there should be more people who understood how to protect what was theirs. David and Gertrude looked at each other across the table. "We'll discuss it," Gertrude told him. "I've already thought it through," James said, with the particular manner of a child who has inherited equal parts his father's conviction and his mother's thoroughness. "I'm sure you have," David said. "Eat your supper." Ruth at 4 was observing all of this from her end of the table with the gray eyes that saw everything and said less than they saw, and she had the look of someone storing the information for future use, which she would turn out to be. The late 1880s brought further change to southern Kansas. The great cattle drives that had defined the region began to wind down as the railroads pushed further into Texas, and the need to drive cattle north diminished. Caldwell, which had lived and breathed on the trail, adjusted slowly and not always easily. Some enterprises that had depended on the drive trade closed. Others found new shapes. The Merritt Ranch adapted because adaptation was Gertrude's deepest competence. She had always run cattle, but she began shifting more deliberately toward breeding stock, toward quality over quantity, toward the market for horses that was growing as the region settled and farming expanded alongside ranching. She and David spent a considerable amount of time in 1887 discussing this shift, going over the numbers, weighing the risks, and she listened to his concerns with her full attention, and he listened to hers, and they made the decision together, which was always how they made decisions. David never thought of this as kneeling. He thought of it as the thing he had been afraid of but had been wrong about, the bending out of shape that he had watched his father do. This was not that. This was two people whose shapes fit together, whose ways of thinking sharpened against each other like whetstone and blade, each made better by the friction. He was not less himself for loving Gertrude Ellsworth. He was more himself. He was the version of himself that the movement and the years had been working toward without his knowing it. He thought about the well on a morning in 1888, standing at the same spot in the yard, the same well with a new rope because the old one had worn out. He thought about the morning in 1878 when she had slipped, and he had moved before the thought told him to move, and he had been on his knees in the mud, and he had looked up at her. He had been right to move. He had been right to kneel. Not because she needed rescuing, she had already caught herself. She was already fine, but because in that moment something in him had refused to let her fall alone, had refused it at the level where the body moves before the mind instructs it. And that refusal was the truest thing about him. The thing he had not known was true until it happened. He was not a man who kneeled before women in the sense of subjugation or weakness or the loss of himself. He was a man who had kneeled before this woman because something in him recognized her, recognized the worth of her, and had acted on that recognition faster than thought. He would have done it again any morning of his life. Tom Bledsoe retired from active ranch work in 1889, his knees giving him the kind of trouble that Kansas winters inflicted on men who had worked hard land for 20 years. He did not leave. He could not leave. The ranch was his home in the way that places become home when you have given them the better part of your years, and Gertrude gave him a permanent room in the house, the small bedroom off the kitchen that had always been a storeroom, and which David converted over 3 weekends into proper living quarters. And Tom became the kind of retired ranch hand who still found small, useful things to do every day, and who took his meals with the family, and who told James and Ruth stories about the early days of the ranch that neither David nor Gertrude had told, because they had not been there yet. "Your mother," Tom told James one evening on the porch, "was running this place with a ledger in one hand and a fence tool in the other when she was 24 years old. I never saw anyone work harder and complain less." "She doesn't complain," James said. "She doesn't," Tom agreed. "Never has. You could learn from that." James was 12. He looked at his mother, who was visible through the window at the kitchen table. "She's the best person I know," he said, which he said simply without any 12-year-old self-consciousness. And Tom looked at him and thought, these children know what they have. David was coming up from the barn when he heard this from the yard, and he stood for a moment outside the circle of the porch light in the dark of a September evening, listening to his son say that, and felt something so complete and clean in his chest that it had no name, only the quality of arriving somewhere after a long distance. He came up the porch steps. "What are you two discussing?" he asked. "Your wife," Tom said. "A good subject," David said, and went inside. She was at the table, the ledger open, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, her dark hair now carrying some silver at the temples which he had not told her, but thought was one of the more beautiful things he had ever seen. She looked up when he came in, and the private smile appeared just briefly before she went back to the ledger. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "Tom is telling James stories about you," he said. "Tom has too much time on his hands," she said. "The stories are all complimentary." "Then Tom is being charitable." "Tom is being accurate," David said, "which is what he always is." She put her pen down and looked at him. After 10 years, she still had that quality of giving him her full attention when she looked at him, and he still felt it, the weight of those steady gray eyes. "You're being charming again," she said. "No," he said. "I'm being factual, as I have always been." She reached across the table and took his hand, the way she had done that July evening in 1878, and he held it. And outside, Tom was still talking on the porch, and Ruth was presumably in her bed, and the Kansas night was wide and dark and full of stars, and the ranch was quiet and working and entirely theirs. "I am glad you came down from Dodge City," she said. "I am glad Carver wrote that letter," he said. "You should write him and tell him." "He knows," David said. "I see him at the Wellington Fair every October, and I buy him a drink, and he says, 'You're welcome,' without waiting for me to say thank you, which tells me he knows." She laughed, the full, sudden one, the one that took over her whole face, and he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, and she settled back in her chair with the ledger and the cooling tea and the lamp throwing gold light on everything, and he went to the window and stood looking out at the dark yard, where the well sat quiet and the cottonwoods moved in the night wind. He was not a man who had believed in Providence, particularly. He was a practical man who believed in work and weather, and the way a fence needed 2 posts replaced on the north corner before it failed. He believed in the evidence of things. He believed in what he could see. He could see the well from the window. He thought of the mud on his knees. He thought of her face looking down at him, the beginning of that careful, uncertain classification in her eyes that had turned over months into something else entirely, into the private smile, into "Yes, I will marry you," into James and Ruth and Tom in the spare room and the garden along the east wall, and 10 years of evenings on the porch. He turned back to the room. She was looking at him. "Come to bed," she said. He came away from the window. The years continued, as years do in the careful, layered way of a life that is properly lived, not without difficulty, not without loss, but with the continuity of people who have built something real and tend it with intention. In 1891, David's old horse, the one that had carried him down from Dodge City with a loose shoe on the left hind, was retired from work and kept in the far pasture where she grazed in the company of 2 other elderly horses that the ranch kept as a matter of principle. Gertrude had instituted this policy, that the animals who had given their working years to the ranch did not go to sale when they were spent, but were allowed to finish their days in the back pasture. And it cost something small and was worth considerably more than it cost. And it was one of the dozens of things about how she ran her life that David thought revealed her entire character in miniature. James Merritt, who had grown into a serious and capable young man of 15, was by this point doing full ranch work alongside his father and the hands, and had not abandoned his intention to study law. Gertrude had been corresponding with a college in Wichita about prospects, and the principal of the Caldwell school had told her that James was one of the 3 best students he had taught in 12 years, which Gertrude relayed to David without any show of pride beyond a brief pause before she moved on to the next subject, which was the most Gertrude ever let pride show and which he had learned to read accurately. "He'll go," David said. "He will," she agreed. "When he's ready." "And the ranch?" She looked at him as if this question was slightly absurd. "The ranch will still be here," she said. Ruth, who was 11 that year and had inherited her mother's gray eyes and her mother's manner of watching everything, and saying what she observed at precisely the moment it would be most effective, announced one evening at supper that, when she grew up, she intended to run the garden market operation and expand it into a proper supply business for the county, and that she had been thinking about which crops would be most profitable for a 5-year rotation, and had some notes she would like to review with her mother. Gertrude looked at her daughter for a long moment. "After supper," she said. "You can show me your notes after supper." David looked at the ceiling briefly, which was the most he allowed himself. Tom, who was 72 and slower but sharp as ever, said, "There she is," in the tone of someone confirming what they had always suspected, and served himself more potatoes. The 1890s brought the full settling of what had been frontier into something more permanently placed: more towns, more railroads, more farms, the cattle operations changing shape as the land changed shape around them. Caldwell had grown past its roughest years and had become a more settled community, with a school and 2 churches and a courthouse and a proper telegraph office. The Kishom Trail days were genuinely past now, a memory rather than a present reality, and the men who had driven cattle north in the big years of the late 1870s had scattered or settled or gone ahead of everyone else into whatever came next. David and Gertrude hosted a gathering at the ranch in the summer of 1893 for a reunion of sorts, Tom's idea. A collection of people who had been part of the early years of the county, ranchers and merchants, and a few old drovers who still lived in the area. It was a warm July Sunday, and they strung paper lanterns in the cottonwoods, and Hector, who had married a woman from Wellington named Clara and lived in town now, but came back for all important occasions, played his guitar, and the evening was long and golden and full of the particular richness of people who share a history. David stood with a cup in his hand, watching the gathering move across the yard under the cottonwoods, watching Gertrude move through it with the same direct ease she brought to everything, stopping to talk, listening fully when she did, laughing that laugh that took over her whole face when someone said something that deserved it. He had been in love with her for 15 years. It was not the same love as that first kneeling in the mud, though that was in it. It had grown into something larger and more various, something with texture and history and the particular strength of things that have been tested and held. He knew her fears and she knew his. He knew the shape of her worry at 3 in the morning, and she knew the silence he needed after a hard day, and neither of them required the other to perform the absence of these things. They were known to each other entirely, and it was the most complete thing David Merritt had ever been part of. Tom Bledsoe died in January of 1895, peacefully in his room off the kitchen, on a morning when the snow was clean and new on the Kansas ground. He was 76 years old, and he had worked honest land for most of those years, and had been loved by the people of the house where he spent his last 6 years, and he died knowing that, which is as good an exit as anyone can hope for. They buried him on the ranch near the cottonwoods, which is where he had said he wanted to be if it came to that, and it came to that, and the stone David set said his name and his years and one line that Gertrude had written. He knew this land. James, who was 19, stood at the grave with his hat in his hands, and his face composed in the manner he had learned from both his parents, which is to say with the feelings present and acknowledged and not suppressed but also not performed. Ruth, who was 15, stood beside her mother and held her hand, which is what they did not always do but did when it mattered. "He was the first person who made me feel like I wasn't alone in this," Gertrude said quietly after. She was looking at the cottonwoods. "After my father, Tom was the one who stayed, and that matters more than most things." David put his arm around her. "You were never alone," he said. "I know," she said. "But I didn't know that then. Tom staying was what let me find out." She leaned against him for a moment in the January cold, and the cottonwoods were bare above the stone, and the sky was the pale blue of the plains in winter, and the ranch was quiet all around them. James did go to study law. He left for Wichita in the autumn of 1896, carrying a good horse and a letter of introduction from the Wellington lawyer and 2 years of correspondence with the college. And he came back for Christmas and for summer, and he wrote often. And his letters were thorough and clearly reasoned, and had his mother's structure and his father's instinct for the essential point. Ruth ran the expanded market garden at 21, with the efficiency she had been promising since she was 11, and she brought in a young woman from town named Agnes to help with the bottling and preserving operation, and the two of them developed a working partnership, and then a friendship, and then something that Gertrude observed carefully without comment, because Ruth was 21 and knew her own mind, and would say what she needed to say when she was ready. The ranch grew into the 20th century with the same qualities it had always had: the clean creek, the good grass, the careful management, the fair dealing. It was not the biggest operation in Sumner County, but it was one of the most stable, and that stability was the product of a kind of intelligence that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with knowing the land and knowing what you were doing and why. David and Gertrude sat on the porch in the evenings as they always had, in the chairs that had replaced the original porch steps as their preferred location, and they watched the Kansas sky do what the Kansas sky always did, its enormous, unrepeatable light shows at dusk. The way the color spread across flat land unobstructed for miles, red and orange, and the particular purple that came just before dark. "James will pass the bar this spring," Gertrude said on an evening in the spring of 1900, reading her son's most recent letter. "He will," David said. "He's thinking of practicing in Wichita." "Is he coming back?" She considered the letter. "He says he's not sure yet, but that he wants to be close enough to come home when it matters." "That's a good answer," David said. She folded the letter. "It is," she agreed. The prairie was going gold in the evening light, and somewhere out in the pasture the horses were moving against the fence line, and the garden along the east wall of the house was fully in April green, 3 times the size it had been in the 1880s, and the cottonwoods were budding pale where Tom's stone stood underneath them. 22 years, Gertrude said. He looked at her. "Next October." "I was thinking about it today," she said. "About the well, about that morning." "I think about that morning too," he said. "You moved before you thought," she said, the same words from years ago which she had never forgotten either. "Yes," he said. Smiled the private one, the one that was only for him. "I had never had anyone do that," she said. "Move toward me before they thought about it. I didn't know what to do with it." "You classified it very carefully," he said. "I did," she agreed. "For several months." He laughed, she laughed. The evening settled around them, warm and still, the particular stillness of spring on the Kansas plain when the wind has gone down and the light is the last level golden kind. "What did you decide?" he asked. It was an old question, the shape of a conversation they had had before, but not in exactly these words. She looked at him steadily, those gray eyes that had not changed, only deepened. "That you were worth the risk," she said. "That you were someone I could trust with the important things." "I hope I've been that," he said. "You have," she said, "every day." He took her hand. They sat on the porch in the spring evening, David and Gertrude Merritt, on the land that was hers and was now theirs, in the life that had been built brick by brick from a morning at a well, and a letter from a man named Carver, and a loose shoe on the left hind, and 31 years of a promise that had broken exactly the right way, in exactly the right place, for exactly the right reason. James Merritt did pass the bar that spring. He practiced in Wichita for 3 years and then came home to Caldwell to open his own practice, because Caldwell needed a lawyer who knew the land, and James Merritt knew the land better than he knew anything else. Ruth and Agnes built the market garden operation into a genuine county business by 1905, supplying 4 general stores in the region with preserved goods, and Ruth was direct about what she and Agnes were to each other in the manner she had learned from her mother, plainly, without drama, to the people who mattered, on her own timeline. Gertrude received this information with the same directness Ruth offered it. She looked at her daughter and she looked at Agnes and she said, "I've known for 2 years. I was waiting for you to be ready to say it." Then she offered them tea and moved on, which was the most Gertrude Ellsworth had ever been capable of performing love and which was entirely, correctly enough. David Merritt, at 57, still rose before dawn. He was slower than he had been. The cold mornings asked more of his back than they had in his 30s, but he was still himself, still the man who moved before the thought told him to move, still the man who had come down from Dodge City and found something he had not known he was looking for. He stood at the well one morning in the October of 1904, drawing water in the early light, and he thought about a morning 26 years before, and a woman with her foot caught on a stone and a bucket swinging free and the mud on his knees. The well had a new rope and new stone coping, and was otherwise the same well it had always been. The ranch was the same ranch and also entirely different, grown and changed and shaped by time and work, and the careful tending of 2 people who had known what they were doing, or had learned it, which is the same thing in the end. He heard the kitchen door behind him. He turned. She was coming across the yard in the October morning, gray-haired now at 52, wearing the same kind of faded dress she had been wearing the first day, her hair pinned simply at the neck with a few strands escaping, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She crossed the yard and stood beside him at the well and handed him a cup. She looked at him. He looked at her. The October sun came up over the flat Kansas land and made everything gold. "The south fence needs checking," she said. "I'll go this morning," he said. "Take James with you. He's been inside with his papers all week. He needs air." "I'll take James." She looked at the horizon. He looked at her. "What?" she said, not turning. "Nothing," he said. She turned and found him looking at her, and the private smile appeared, unchanged by 26 years, still only for him. "Stop that," she said. "I'm being factual," he said. She shook her head and drank her coffee and looked out at the prairie, and he stood beside her at the well in the October morning, and the cottonwoods were gold above Tom Bledsoe's stone, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, and somewhere a horse called once and was answered, and the sky was enormous and blue and full of the good, endless silence of a place that has been lived in long enough to feel like the shape of the people who live in it. David Merritt had sworn 31 years before this morning that he would never kneel before any woman. He had been wrong about what that meant. He had thought it meant keeping himself intact, keeping the shape of himself from being bent by someone else's needs. What he had not understood, what he had needed a stumble at a well and a muddy yard, and a pair of steady gray eyes to understand, was that kneeling was not subjugation. Kneeling was recognition. It was the body's way of saying, "Here is something worth the gesture. Here is something that matters enough to bring me down out of my own height and into the dirt of the honest world." He had kneeled. He had risen. He was still rising. He stood at the well in the October morning with the woman who was his life, and drank his coffee, and the Kansas sun came up all the way, and the day began.